In the sleepy market town of Flaxborough, the morning dawned with the sort of crisp, ordinary calm that seemed to settle the world in place. It was the kind of day where the town square hummed with the quiet murmur of post-breakfast chatter. The stalls at the flower show were being set up with care, and in the distance the muffled clink of teacups punctuated the tranquillity as a few early risers convened in the local cafe. If there was a suggestion of anything unusual in the air, it was so faint that only the most observant might have noticed. Then, at the precise moment Mrs. Seddon, Flaxborough's self-appointed second-hand dealer, began to set up her prize-winning chrysanthemums under the careful eye of the local horticultural society, the world quietly shifted. A sharp, unmistakable cry came from the direction of the churchyard. It was not a scream of terror, not the type that would send a flurry of townsfolk rushing toward the scene. No, this was more of a squawk, a short, startled sound that was as inconspicuous as it was alarming, just enough to be noticed by those with a taste for minor drama. Mrs. Seddon, at her flower stand, paused and sniffed the air. But it wasn't the scent of lilacs or marigolds that caught her attention. It was the strange, unsettling stillness that followed the cry. People turned their heads, a few eyebrows raised, but no one seemed to move. This was, after all, Flaxborough. No one ever rushed anywhere unless it was for tea or a well-timed gossip. Then, like a stone dropped in a pond, the ripples began. First, it was a few slow and deliberate steps from the town constable, who nodded to Mrs. Seddon in passing. His hand was on the brim of his hat, just enough to show that something was amiss, but not enough to suggest anything drastic. And then, of course, gossip, always eager to be first on the scene, began its swift, infectious work. "Oh, you'll never guess," Mrs. Seddon said, leaning toward her nearest neighbour, her voice just loud enough for the small crowd to hear. "The vicar's been seen with the widow in black, in the churchyard no less. Quite the sight, I'm told. Aren't they both rather devoted to their duties?" came the hesitant reply from Mrs. Hargraves, her tone sceptical but curious. "Devoted, yes," Mrs. Seddon continued, her lips curling into a sly smile. "But we all know how it goes in Flaxborough, don't we? Nothing ever stays hidden for long." The rest of the morning passed without further incident, though a certain quiet hum had settled over the town. The flower show went on, but the town had subtly divided into two factions, those who pretended not to know and those who could hardly wait to gossip. The widow in black, known simply as Mrs. Reynolds to those who barely knew her, had, in a matter of minutes, become the talk of the town. By noon, the quiet clink of teacups had been replaced with sharp whispers in every corner of Flaxborough. A dozen different versions of the event swirled through the air, each adding a new layer to the story. The widow had been seen at the churchyard gate. No, she'd been standing far too close to the vicar. She was certainly not mourning. Why else would she wear that black veil so mysteriously? Hadn't she been widowed for years now? And what exactly were the two of them doing there, so near the graves? It was precisely at this moment that Inspector Purbright arrived. The inspector was, as ever, the very picture of understated competence. His grey suit, slightly worn at the cuffs, was precisely as one would expect of a man who had spent too many years in an office or at the scene of some peculiar happening. His spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, though his sharp eyes had little need of them for detail. What he missed in fashion, he more than made up for in methodical intelligence, and that rare ability to blend into a scene without becoming its focal point. Purbright had been enjoying a rather ordinary morning when the call had come in. A matter of some concern had arisen, so he made his way to the scene in his usual, unhurried manner. He knew the town as well as he knew his own thoughts, and this was no ordinary morning. He could sense that much. The moment he arrived at the churchyard, he found himself standing quietly behind the stone wall. Two figures lingered near the iron gate, the vicar, Mr. Orville, and the widow, Mrs. Reynolds. whose black dress fluttered lightly in the early autumn breeze. Purbright stood there, watching them for a moment. It was the small things that caught his attention. How Mrs. Reynolds had turned her head so slightly as she spoke to the vicar, her veil brushing across the faintest smile. How Mr. Orville's hand, though resting casually on the gate, was ever so slightly clenched. His brow was furrowed, though it seemed to be nothing more than the product of a routine, late-afternoon squabble. And yet something had stirred. Something unusual had unfolded in that otherwise ordinary churchyard, and Purbright was not one to let such things slip away. He straightened his coat, adjusted his glasses, and made his way toward them with his usual deliberation. Neither of the two seemed to notice him until he had already reached the gate, where he paused with a courteous nod. "Good afternoon. Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Orville?" Purbright said, his tone polite and measured, yet carrying that subtle note of authority that made both parties stiffen, even if only slightly. "Good afternoon, Inspector," Mr. Orville replied, his voice slightly higher than usual. Mrs. Reynolds offered a quick nod, but there was something faintly guarded in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation, as though she were already bracing for what might come next. Purbright took a moment, allowing the silence to stretch comfortably before he spoke again. "I believe we've had a small disturbance here, haven't we?" "Something unsettling, perhaps?" he said, his eyes flicking from one to the other. Mr. Orville cleared his throat, a clear sign that he was about to offer a carefully worded response. But before he could speak, Mrs. Reynolds tilted her head, her lips curling into his soft, fleeting smile. "Oh, nothing worth troubling you, Inspector," she said, her voice smooth but carrying just enough weight to suggest there was more to the matter than met the eye. Purbright gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the sort of smile reserved for those who thought they had concealed their secrets well. "I'm sure," he said gently, but with an edge that only the observant might have detected. "But I do believe I shall have to ask a few questions all the same." The inspector's mind was already ticking. There was more to this than a mere cry in the churchyard. Something was amiss in Flaxborough, and it was time to see just how deep the rabbit hole went. The town square remained calm, a soft hum of activity floating in the air as Purbright's quiet steps carried him through the bustling streets. The matter of Mrs. Reynolds and Mr. Orville still lingered in his mind, but there was more to the incident than just a simple exchange between the widow and the vicar. He had seen enough in his years to recognize the patterns of small-town life and even smaller-town secrets. The churchyard had returned to its usual stillness, save for the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. Purbright, however, was not easily deterred by appearances. As he stood by the gate, watching the last of the flower show preparations unfold in the distance, he knew that what he had just observed was only the beginning. His instincts were precise, sharpened over years of watching people, listening to the pauses in their words, noting the subtle shifts in their posture. It wasn't the half-hearted smile Mrs. Reynolds had given him, or the tightness in Mr. Orville's voice that caught his attention. It was the smallest of details, how Mr. Orville's coat sleeve had caught on the iron gate, pulling just slightly as he turned away. A minor thing, to be sure, but enough to nudge Purbright's curiosity further. The inspector straightened his coat, adjusted his glasses, and took a steadying breath. He would need to speak with the key players in this little drama, Mrs. Reynolds first. She was, after all, the one who had become the subject of every whispered conversation in Flaxborough, and where there were whispers, there were always cracks in the facade. He had learned long ago that people in Flaxborough often spoke more through their silence than their words, and it was in that silence, in the hesitations, that he would find the truth. So, with no sense of urgency but an acute awareness of the quiet tension brewing in the town, Purbright made his way to Mrs. Reynolds' house, a modest home tucked just beyond the edge of the square. Her windows, shaded by heavy curtains, suggested a desire for privacy, a privacy, Purbright suspected, That might be about to crack. Mrs. Reynolds answered the door quickly, as if she had been expecting him. Her black dress, so typical of her mourning attire, seemed almost too formal for someone who had been widowed for years, and the sharpness in her eyes betrayed more than a simple sense of decorum. She was the widow in black, and she was about to become the center of a mystery. "Inspector," she greeted him, her voice steady but not without a hint of wariness. "I wasn't expecting you so soon. Is there something I can help you with?" Purbright gave a courteous nod, taking a brief moment to survey the neatness of her entryway. Everything in its place, nothing out of order. Yet, beneath the surface, Purbright could feel the faintest tension radiating from her, a sense of quiet restraint that begged for exploration. "I'm afraid I've had reports of some disturbance near the churchyard earlier today," Purbright said, his voice calm and unhurried. "I'd like to ask a few questions, if you don't mind." Mrs. Reynolds hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside to let him in. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of lavender, and a small fire crackled quietly in the hearth. She gestured to a set of armchairs by the window, and Purbright settled himself in one, watching her carefully as she perched on the edge of her own chair. "I'm sure you've heard the gossip by now," Purbright continued, his voice as even as ever. "The cry we heard in the churchyard, for instance." "I take it you were near the gate when it happened?" Mrs. Reynolds stiffened slightly, her fingers curling ever so slightly around the edge of her skirt. "I was indeed there, but it wasn't anything worth bothering you about, Inspector," she replied. "Just a misunderstanding, I assure you." "Nothing sinister?" "Indeed," Purbright said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched her response. There was something about her calmness that did not sit right with him. A little too practiced, a little too composed. But that was the problem with Flaxborough. Everyone was so adept at hiding things beneath layers of pleasantries. "You were speaking with Mr. Orville, weren't you?" he asked, leaning forward just enough to show interest without being intrusive. "The vicar, I mean." Mrs. Reynolds nodded, her gaze flickering away momentarily. "Yes, we were talking. Nothing unusual, Inspector? The vicar is a good man, and we were just, well, discussing church matters, as we often do." Purbright made a mental note of her words, her careful tone, the subtle shift in her eyes. There was a deeper story here, he was sure of it. And Mr. Orville, the vicar, had to be part of it. "Of course," Purbright said, his voice warm but deliberate. "But might I ask, were you alone when you left the churchyard?" "Perhaps, I don't know, in a rush." "I gather you don't often find yourself at the church this time of day." Mrs. Reynolds's smile wavered, the smallest of twitches pulling at the corners of her mouth. "I do visit now and then," she said, though the weight of her words was heavier than she intended. "I suppose you're implying that there's more to this than meets the eye, Inspector?" "Not at all," Purbright replied with a softness that only made his words feel sharper. "But I do believe in asking all the right questions, and sometimes one must dig a little deeper than the obvious answers." The room seemed to fall into an uneasy silence as Mrs. Reynolds fixed her gaze on him, her lips pressed into a thin line. There was more to her than she was letting on, and Purbright could feel it, a quiet, unresolved mystery that hovered just beneath her carefully maintained exterior. He sat back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping on the armrest. "Tell me, Mrs. Reynolds, what is it you believe people might be saying about you?" "About your relationship with the vicar?" The question, though phrased innocuously, landed like a heavy stone. Mrs. Reynolds' eyes flashed with something unreadable, perhaps defiance or guilt, but she quickly masked it with a practiced air of indifference. "I don't concern myself with what people say, Inspector," she said coolly, "but I am sure you have your own conclusions, as you always do." Purbright's lips twitched ever so slightly at her remark. The widow in black was not as composed as she thought. There was something hidden beneath her neat appearance, something not quite right, and Purbright was getting closer to finding it. As he stood to leave, Purbright gave her one last, measured look. "You've been most helpful, Mrs. Reynolds, but I'll need to speak with Mr. Orville next. Perhaps he'll offer some clarity to this situation." Mrs. Reynolds nodded, though the faintest tension lingered in her shoulders. "Of course, Inspector," she said, her voice colder now. "Do let me know if there's anything further I can assist with." Purbright didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped toward the door, pausing as he reached the threshold. "I'm sure you're familiar with the old saying, Mrs. Reynolds," he said, his voice quiet but pointed. "The more people deny, the more there is to uncover." With that, he closed the door behind him, leaving her to her thoughts. And as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that Flaxborough's quiet routine was about to be disrupted in ways no one could have predicted. Inspector Purbright walked through the cobblestone streets of Flaxborough, his mind replaying the conversation with Mrs. Reynolds. Something about the widow's carefully composed answers unsettled him. She had been just a little too swift in her dismissals, as though she feared being scrutinized too closely, yet was intent on deflecting attention away from something more significant. There was a hidden story in her words, one that would not reveal itself without further probing. As he approached the church, Purbright's thoughts turned to Mr. Orville. The vicar was a man of routine, seemingly devoted to his work and the quiet, steady life of the village. But, as Purbright had learned over the years, routine often masked the most telling signs. The vicar's interactions with the widow had been far too casual, and Purbright was growing increasingly convinced that there was more to their connection than mere coincidence. The church bell tolled in the distance, its sound clear and steady as it marked the hour. Purbright paused for a moment, taking in the scene before him. The church, its old stone walls weathered by time, stood silently against the sky. It was the kind of place that seemed to hold 100 years of secrets within its hallowed walls. And yet, even a place as venerable as this could not escape the pull of human folly and error. He entered the churchyard, where the stone walls rose up like quiet sentinels, offering little insight into the lives of those who passed through them. The vicar's study was tucked away at the back of the church, an unassuming building that seemed more like a small cottage than a place of contemplation. Purbright knew the path well, having walked it many times over the years, but today there was a new sense of purpose in his steps. As he approached the door, he was greeted by the soft sound of rustling papers from within. The vicar, as expected, was busy with some task or another. Purbright gave a firm but polite knock, and after a brief pause, the door opened to reveal Mr. Orville. The vicar looked as he always did, tall, slightly stooped, with a thin, sharp face and eyes that seemed ever watchful. His clerical collar was pristine, the starched white of it cutting a stark contrast to his worn black suit. He looked in all respects the model of a man devoted to his calling. "Inspector?" Mr. Orville greeted him with a smile that was both weary and polite. "What brings you here today?" Purbright returned the smile with his usual calm demeanour. "Good afternoon, Mr. Orville. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I find myself in need of a word with you, if you have a moment." "Of course," the vicar replied, stepping aside to let the inspector in. Come in, come in. I was just finishing some of my correspondence." "Can I offer you a drink? Tea, perhaps?" "Tea would be lovely, thank you," Purbright said, stepping inside. The room smelled of polished wood and old paper, with the faint aroma of incense lingering in the corners. A small fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a welcome contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. As Purbright took a seat, he noted the cluttered desk, papers stacked haphazardly around the edges. There were books on theology, a few worn volumes of poetry, and a stack of parish bulletins. Nothing out of the ordinary for a man in Mr. Orville's position. The vicar poured the tea, his movements slow and deliberate. He handed Purbright a cup before sitting down across from him, folding his hands in his lap. "So," Mr. Orville began, his voice steady but tinged with a note of curiosity. "What is it that brings you to me this afternoon, Inspector?" Purbright took a moment before replying, his tone measured. "I understand you were at the churchyard earlier today, Mr. Orville, with Mrs. Reynolds." The vicar's expression remained unchanged, though there was a brief flicker of tension in his eyes before it was carefully concealed. He cleared his throat. "Yes, I was. We had a brief conversation, nothing more." Purbright's gaze never wavered. "I see, and would you care to elaborate on that conversation?" Mr. Orville took a sip of his tea, his eyes lowering for just a moment as though he were considering how much to reveal. He set the cup down with a soft clink, his fingers lingering on the rim. "It was a rather routine discussion, Inspector. As you know, Mrs. Reynolds has been a member of the parish for many years now. We were merely discussing some church matters. There's nothing suspicious about it." Purbright leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but firm. "Is that so? I've spoken with Mrs. Reynolds, and she seems to suggest otherwise. She's been rather guarded, in fact." "It's curious, don't you think?" A quiet conversation at the churchyard, followed by a sudden and sharp silence, almost as if something or someone was trying to avoid notice. The vicar's lips tightened for just a moment, a subtle shift that didn't escape Purbright's notice. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Inspector," he replied, his voice steady but just a shade too controlled. "We've always had a cordial relationship." "Nothing more." Purbright nodded, though his mind was already processing the inconsistencies. "I'm sure. But I'd appreciate it if you could tell me more about your relationship with Mrs. Reynolds. It seems unusually close for someone in her situation. A widow, alone for so long. Surely there must be more to it." The vicar's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, and for the briefest moment there was a flicker of something, perhaps guilt or frustration, before it was quickly masked by the practiced air of a man of the cloth. "We are both servants of the Lord." "Inspector," Mr. Orville said, his voice low but edged with a certain defensiveness, "I offer my counsel where it is needed, and that is all." Purbright studied him for a long moment, weighing the vicar's words carefully. There was something here, something hidden beneath the surface of the vicar's calm demeanour. But it wasn't just the conversation with Mrs. Reynolds that struck him. It was the way Mr. Orville's voice trembled ever so slightly when he spoke about their relationship. A flicker of something real, something telling. "I understand," Purbright said, his voice even but heavy with implication. "But I do believe I'll need to speak with Mrs. Reynolds again, just to make sure I have all the facts straight. Would you happen to know where I might find her this afternoon?" The vicar's lips pressed together in a tight line, his gaze briefly flickering toward the window, as if contemplating whether to offer anything more. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "You'll find her at home, Inspector," Mr. Orville said, his voice firm once again. "But I assure you there's nothing more to this than you already know." Purbright rose from his chair, giving the vicar one final, appraising glance. "I do hope so, Mr. Orville," he said quietly. "But something tells me there's more than meets the eye in Flaxborough today." With that, Purbright took his leave, closing the door softly behind him. As he stepped out into the cool air, the town seemed quieter than before. The whispers of the flower show, the hushed voices in the market square, all of it had become a little more pronounced. The pieces were falling into place, and Purbright was beginning to see the picture form. As Purbright walked away from the vicarage, the streets of Flaxborough felt colder, though the autumn sun still hung in the sky. He had learned little from Mr. Orville that hadn't already been guessed. The vicar's smooth denials, the careful choice of words, all pointed to a man trying to cover something up, a man who feared the inspector's questions more than he let on. Purbright's steps were measured, his thoughts lingering on the subtle exchanges he had just witnessed. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about this town, this quiet, ordinary place, was about to erupt with secrets. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. The churchyard had been the setting for something more than a casual chat. The way the widow and the vicar had been positioned, so close, yet so careful to maintain propriety, suggested a history that neither was eager to reveal. Their interactions hadn't been the cordial exchanges of two long-time acquaintances. They were something more private, something fragile, and possibly something dangerous. Purbright's mind turned to Mrs. Reynolds. She had been too quick to dismiss the event in the churchyard, too poised in her avoidance of deeper questioning. There was a story there, a thread to follow, and Purbright intended to pull at it until it unravelled completely. But first, he needed to see her again, this time without the pretense of casual conversation. It didn't take long to reach Mrs. Reynolds' house. It sat on the edge of the square, nestled among the other cottages, its neat facade offering no hint of the tension that hung in the air. As Purbright approached the door, he paused, taking in the calm surroundings. This was a town that prided itself on its secrets, a town that lived under the surface of public appearances. And yet, beneath it all, it was the quiet ones, the ones who knew the price of discretion, that held the most to hide. Mrs. Reynolds opened the door almost before he could knock. Her eyes, dark and watchful, met his, though her lips betrayed nothing more than a polite smile. She had been expecting him? "Inspector?" she said smoothly, stepping aside to allow him in. "I trust you've been making progress in your investigations." "Not quite yet," Purbright replied, his tone polite but firm. "But I do have a few more questions if you don't mind." The widow gestured for him to sit. The same lavender scent filled the room, a familiar comfort that almost made Purbright feel as though he had stepped into a different world altogether. A world of quiet elegance, where everything had its place and no chaos could enter without careful orchestration. Purbright took a seat and watched Mrs. Reynolds as she moved about, offering him a cup of tea, though her eyes remained calculating. She was waiting for him to ask the questions that would break the facade. "I'd like to revisit our conversation earlier," Purbright said after a moment. "About the churchyard. You said there was nothing unusual about it, but I find that hard to believe. I'm sure you can appreciate why I might be concerned." Mrs. Reynolds set the teacup down, her hands still as she folded her fingers over the rim. "Inspector, I've told you all there is to know. I was simply speaking with Mr. Orville, as we always do. I fail to see why this should concern you." Purbright studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You see, Mrs. Reynolds, I've spoken with Mr. Orville as well, and while he's been very careful with his words, I can't help but feel there's more to the story." She met his gaze for a moment, her eyes flashing with something. Fear? Anger? Or perhaps both before she looked away. "I'm not sure what more you expect me to say, Inspector. The churchyard is a public place. We were having a private discussion, but that's nothing to do with anyone else." Purbright's voice was calm, almost too calm. "I disagree. You see, it's the manner in which both of you handled yourselves that interests me. You both appeared to be avoiding something or someone. Now, I'm not one to jump to conclusions, Mrs. Reynolds, but the way you've acted today, especially the way you brushed aside my questions, it suggests that there is indeed something here that's being concealed." The widow's hands tightened on the cup she had just set down, her knuckles paling. She was no longer the poised, controlled woman who had greeted him earlier. Her facade was beginning to crack, and Purbright was close enough to see the first signs of it. "I don't know what you think you're getting at, Inspector," she said, her voice unsteady, betraying more than she intended. "But I assure you there's nothing untoward going on." Purbright took a slow breath, leaning forward just slightly. "Then why don't you tell me about the last time you spoke with Mr. Orville? Was it truly just a casual conversation about church matters? Or was it something more personal?" At the mention of the word personal, Mrs. Reynolds stiffened. For a brief moment her eyes darted to the window, her gaze flickering with panic. It was subtle, but it was there. She had reacted. "And Purbright had seen it. She began, but the words faltered, as though she were searching for a way to deny something that had already been set in motion. Purbright leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "You know, Mrs. Reynolds, in a town like this, people can be very quick to pass judgment. They talk, they speculate. And the more you avoid the truth, the more curious they become. Wouldn't you agree?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was as though she were calculating her next move, whether to continue denying or to finally confess something that had been hidden for far too long. I don't know what you want from me," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I spoke with Mr. Orville. Yes, there was something more than just a casual chat. But it was nothing that could harm anyone." Purbright's eyes narrowed, sensing the shift in her words. "Then why all the secrecy? Why the guarded responses? If there's nothing to hide, then why not tell me everything?" For the first time, Mrs. Reynolds faltered, her composure cracking in the face of his steady, probing gaze. Because it wasn't just a conversation, Inspector. It was something I didn't think anyone would understand. I didn't want to cause trouble. Purbright waited, his patience stretching taut, but he said nothing. His silence pressed against her, urging her to continue. She hesitated for a long moment, her hands wringing the edges of her skirt as she struggled to find the right words. It wasn't just about church matters. It was about him, about Mr. Orville and me. The confession hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mrs. Reynolds had said it. The thread had been pulled, and now the full extent of it was starting to unfurl before them both. Purbright didn't push her further. He simply let the silence linger, allowing her to make the next move. Her eyes were downcast now, unable to meet his. "We were close," she whispered. But it wasn't something anyone could know. Not here, not in Flaxborough. Purbright's mind raced as the pieces began to align. The widow in black, the vicar with his guarded manner, the town's whispered gossip. It was all connected, and it was only a matter of time before the full picture emerged. Then, "Perhaps, Mrs. Reynolds," he said softly, "you can help me understand what really happened that day in the churchyard." Mrs. Reynolds's hands, still clasped tightly in her lap, trembled slightly as the silence stretched between them. Her eyes flickered to the window once more, as though searching for an escape from Purbright's steady gaze. He didn't rush her. The quiet moments, when a person was forced to confront their own words, always yielded more than any interrogation ever could. "I don't understand why you're so concerned." "Inspector," she said, her voice still strained but now tinged with a quiet desperation. "What happened between Mr. Orville and me? It was nothing." We both moved on. "It was a mistake." Purbright remained motionless, his eyes never leaving hers. "A mistake," he repeated, his tone thoughtful but not judgmental. "A mistake that led to secrecy. A mistake that you both felt compelled to hide." Mrs. Reynolds flinched, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her skirt. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't just about us, it was about the town. The way they would have looked at us. The way they would have talked." She paused, swallowing hard. "You see, Mr. Orville, he's a man of God, and She hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't want to destroy his reputation." "Or mine." Purbright's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "And yet you've come here now, speaking with me. Why is that, Mrs. Reynolds?" Her gaze dropped to her hands, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. "Because I've lived with this guilt, Inspector. It's been eating away at me for months. The way we've pretended it never happened. The lies we've told. The people we've hurt just by pretending everything was fine. It's not fair to anyone, especially not to you." The inspector nodded, slowly absorbing her words. The confession wasn't complete, but it was enough to shift the direction of his investigation. He had expected secrecy. People in Flaxborough were masters of it. But he had not anticipated this kind of quiet self-awareness from Mrs. Reynolds. She wasn't just protecting Mr. Orville. She was protecting herself from the very truth she now found herself sharing. "You mentioned the town," Purbright said after a pause. "What exactly did you mean by that?" Mrs. Reynolds glanced up at him, her expression stricken. The town talks, Inspector. Always has. And Mr. Orville, he's the vicar. The one person who is meant to be above reproach. The one person who couldn't afford to have their private life exposed. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. If anyone found out about us, about the affair, it would ruin everything. The church, his position, everything. Purbright sat back in his chair, taking in her words. It wasn't just an affair. It was a crime of reputation, one that threatened to pull apart the very fabric of the town. And it wasn't just about love or lust. It was about the power of perception, of the delicate web that held Flaxborough together. "You've been hiding the truth for a long time, haven't you?" he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not just your secret anymore, Mrs. Reynolds. Not when a cry is heard in the churchyard. Not when Mr. Orville's reputation is at stake." The widow nodded, her face flushed with a mix of guilt and relief. "I didn't want anyone to know. But after today, I don't know. I couldn't keep running from it." "Not anymore." Purbright was silent for a moment, his mind racing with possibilities. Mrs. Reynolds had confessed, more than he'd expected, in fact, but there were still pieces missing. The cry in the churchyard, for one. And why had it been heard at that particular moment? Why hadn't either of them acted when the gossip had started to swirl? Was this just a case of a secret gone wrong, or was there more to it? "You said there was a cry," Purbright said, his voice steady. A cry that caused such a stir. But what was it, really? Was it a simple accident, or was it something more? Mrs. Reynolds hesitated, her fingers now twisting in the folds of her skirt. She paused, then swallowed hard. "It was me. I lost control for a moment. I thought someone might see us. I didn't want anyone to know, and I panicked." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were so careful. But that moment, when I saw the people coming toward the churchyard, I panicked, Inspector." Purbright processed her words, piecing together the timeline in his mind. The panic, the secrecy, the fear of being exposed, it all made sense in a way. But it still didn't explain the cry itself, the noise that had startled the town and sent whispers racing through the market square. There was more here, more that Mrs. Reynolds wasn't yet ready to admit. "You said you thought someone might see you," Purbright said slowly. "Who exactly were you worried about?" Mrs. Reynolds' eyes darted to the window once more, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she seemed to shrink into herself, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her confession had taken all the strength from her. "Was it someone who had seen you before?" Purbright pressed. "Someone who might have known what was really going on between you and Mr. Orville?" The widow remained silent, her lips pressed tightly together. It was clear that she had more to say, but something was holding her back, something deep within her that she still wasn't ready to confront. Purbright watched her for a long moment, allowing the silence to stretch. Finally, when she seemed ready to break, he spoke again. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said gently, "there's still a missing piece to this puzzle. I understand you've confessed to more than I expected, but I need to know everything. The truth. Without any more hiding." Her face paled at his words, and she looked at him with something between fear and regret. Slowly, as if drawn out by the force of his calm persistence, she spoke. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered. "But there's someone who knows everything." "Someone who saw us," Purbright's interest piqued. "Who?" Mrs. Reynolds hesitated. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment it seemed as though she was weighing whether to finally reveal the final secret she had held so tightly. "The priest," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "The one who saw us in the churchyard that day." "He's the one who's been watching us all along." Purbright's mind raced, connecting the dots. The priest. This was a development he hadn't anticipated, and yet it made perfect sense. There was someone else, someone who had been lurking in the shadows of Flaxborough, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. The words hung in the air between them, a quiet weight that seemed to press down on everything in the room. The priest, a figure who had been watching them all along, Purbright leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in the narrative. "You're saying that the priest knows about you and Mr. Orville?" he asked, his voice calm but insistent. "That he saw you together in the churchyard?" Mrs. Reynolds nodded slowly, her eyes locked on her hands as though unable to meet his gaze. "Yes," she whispered. "He's the one who came by that day, just after I panicked. He saw us. And he's been watching us ever since." Purbright absorbed the new information, his mind working through the implications. The priest wasn't just a casual observer in this small-town drama, he was an active participant, holding the knowledge that could bring everything crashing down. But why had he waited so long to make his move? And what was his role in this quiet web of secrecy and fear? "Did he speak to either of you after that day?" Purbright asked, his voice soft but pointed. "Has he made any direct contact with you or Mr. Orville?" Mrs. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twitching as she clasped them tightly together. "No," she said, the word coming out quickly, almost too quickly. "He hasn't said anything to either of us. But I know he's watching. I can feel it. I've seen him, at the church, standing in the doorway when no one's around watching. He hasn't said a word, but I know he knows." Purbright sat back in his chair, considering her words. The priest had been lurking in the shadows, observing, perhaps biding his time. But why? What was his game in all of this? Was he waiting for the right moment to reveal what he knew, or was there something else at play? Purbright could feel the tension in the air, thick and charged, as though the town itself were holding its breath. "Why hasn't he said anything?" Purbright asked, more to himself than to her. "What does he want, Mrs. Reynolds?" She shook her head, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "I don't know. He's always been quiet, mysterious even. People talk about him, but no one knows much about him. He's not like the other priests, not like Mr. Orville. There's something about him, something I don't trust." Purbright's mind was racing now, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. The priest had the knowledge to destroy Mr. Orville's reputation, and perhaps even Mrs. Reynolds, but he had remained silent. Why? What was his motive? And how long had he been keeping watch over them? Was it for some personal gain, or was there something more sinister at play? "I'll need to speak with him," Purbright said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I need to hear what he has to say." Mrs. Reynolds looked up at him, her expression pleading. "Please, Inspector," she said, her voice tight with fear. "You have to understand, he's not like the others. He's dangerous. If you go after him, you might make things worse. He'll ruin everything." Purbright's gaze softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "I'm not going after him to ruin anything, Mrs. Reynolds. I'm going after him to understand what's really happening in this town. The truth can't remain hidden forever, no matter how hard some people try." Her face crumpled slightly at his words, and for a moment it seemed as though she might say something more, something crucial. But instead she simply nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She had already said more than she intended, and now, it seemed, the rest of the story was out of her hands. Purbright stood, giving her one last look. "I'll speak with the priest, but this doesn't end here, Mrs. Reynolds. You need to be prepared for what comes next. There are no more secrets left to hide." She didn't answer him, her eyes fixed on the floor. The quiet of the room was oppressive, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her as she sat there, lost in her own thoughts. As Purbright stepped out into the cool evening air, he felt the tension in the air shift. The town, it seemed, was on the verge of something. The priest's silent watch, Mrs. Reynolds' confession, and the vicar's hidden past. Each piece of the puzzle was now in motion. And as much as Purbright wanted to resolve the mystery quickly, he knew it would take time. The truth always did. But with each conversation, each step he took, the picture became clearer. The priest was the final piece. and Purbright was determined to find him, to unravel whatever it was that had kept him in the shadows for so long. The evening air was cool as Purbright made his way through Flaxborough's winding streets, the fading light casting long shadows on the cobblestone paths. His mind was occupied with the events of the day, the widow's confession, the priest's unsettling silence, and the vicar's guarded demeanour. Every step he took seemed to carry him closer to something hidden, something more than just an affair or a gossip-fueled scandal. It was beginning to feel as though the town itself was built on secrets, and each one of them was a thread pulling him further into a web. He had spent a considerable amount of time with Mrs. Reynolds, trying to piece together the puzzle, but now he had to confront the priest. She had made him out to be a dangerous figure, but Purbright knew that most people's fears were often exaggerated. Still, there was something about the way she had described him. A man who watched from the shadows, who lingered at the edge of the town's attention. It was a kind of power, the ability to observe without being seen, to know things without being involved. And Purbright needed to understand that power. As he walked toward the church, the familiar sight of its stone walls loomed ahead, the building standing stoically against the evening sky. He had passed it countless times over the years, always aware of its presence but never considering the complexity hidden within its walls. Tonight it felt different. The church, with its timeless quiet, seemed to hold more than just prayers and hymns. It held the weight of something unsaid. Purbright stepped into the churchyard, his shoes making soft sounds on the gravel. He had been here many times, but this was the first time he felt the true weight of the place. The church, the priest, the widow, everything about this situation felt as though it had been carefully crafted over time, each piece falling into place just so until now, when it could no longer remain hidden. The door to the vicarage was ajar, a faint light spilling from within. Purbright approached, pausing briefly before he knocked. He wasn't sure what to expect when the priest opened the door, but the sense of inevitability hung in the air. It was time to hear his side of the story. When the door creaked open, Purbright was met with the quiet face of Father Aldridge. He was not an imposing figure, tall but slender, his face gentle and unremarkable, his eyes calm yet watchful. There was a quiet power in his presence, a stillness that seemed to settle the air around him. "Inspector," Father Aldridge greeted him, his voice calm, almost as if he had been expecting him. "What brings you here this evening?" Purbright studied him for a moment, taking in the priest's composed demeanour. There was something about Aldridge, something off, perhaps. His tone was polite, even warm, but there was a coolness beneath it that Purbright couldn't quite place. "I've come to ask you a few questions, Father," Purbright said, his tone steady. "About Mrs. Reynolds and about your connection with her." Father Aldridge didn't flinch, his expression remaining unchanged. He stepped aside to allow Purbright into the dimly lit study, where the scent of incense still lingered in the air. The room was sparse. Shelves of books lined the walls, a small desk covered in papers, and a flickering candle casting shadows on the walls. It was a space that suggested quiet contemplation, but also something more, something hidden. "I see," Father Aldridge said, closing the door softly behind Purbright. "I've had some suspicion this moment would come. Flaxborough is a town of whispers, isn't it, Inspector? People talk when they shouldn't, and suddenly a quiet life is disrupted by the noise of others." Purbright gave a small nod, watching him closely. "I'm afraid it's not just whispers this time, Father. It's more than just idle gossip. People are afraid of what's been happening between you, Mrs. Reynolds, and the vicar." The priest's eyes flickered for the briefest moment, but his expression remained calm. "Mrs. Reynolds has been a member of the parish for many years," he said, his voice even. "And, as with all good parishioners, it is my duty to offer counsel. But I assure you there is nothing untoward between us." Purbright didn't buy the smoothness of his words, the careful neutrality of his tone. "Nothing untoward," he repeated, a small but deliberate pause in his voice. "You mean to tell me that you were simply offering counsel when you and Mrs. Reynolds were seen together in the churchyard, just before the commotion started?" The priest's lips pressed together in a tight line, the slightest twitch in his jaw betraying the first hint of discomfort. "We were speaking about matters of faith, Inspector. Nothing more." Purbright's eyes never wavered. "You're a man of the cloth, Father. I don't doubt your faith or your intentions. But you must understand that your presence, your closeness with Mrs. Reynolds has raised questions. And I need you to help me answer them." There was a long silence, during which the priest looked down at his hands as though gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, it was with a weight that seemed to settle over his words. "Yes, I've been in contact with Mrs. Reynolds," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "But it wasn't what people might think. It wasn't about an affair. It was about something far darker." Purbright's interest piqued, his mind immediately shifting gears. "What do you mean? Something darker?" Father Aldridge stepped away from the door, walking slowly toward the window, as though searching for something in the night beyond. "There are things in this town, Inspector. Things people don't see. Things they choose not to see. But I've been watching for years, and I've seen them all." Purbright remained silent, waiting for the priest to continue. He wasn't sure where this conversation was headed, but it was clear that the priest was not as removed from the secrets of Flaxborough as he had initially appeared. "I've seen how people pretend," Father Aldridge continued, his voice taking on a new intensity. "They pretend that everything is fine, that the sins of the past don't linger in the corners. But they do, Inspector. They always do." The priest's words hung in the air, thick with implication. Purbright didn't respond immediately, his mind racing to process what he was hearing. The priest knew something he hadn't yet revealed. "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Reynolds is hiding something more than just an affair?" Purbright asked, his voice low but urgent. Father Aldridge turned to face him, his expression grim. "I don't know everything, Inspector. But I know enough. Flaxborough has a past, a history that people are trying to forget. But the sins of this town have a way of coming to light, and when they do, they won't be pretty." Purbright felt the weight of the priest's words, each one cutting through the veil of politeness that had surrounded their conversation. The priest was hiding something, but whether it was his own guilt or something more, Purbright couldn't yet tell. "I need you to be specific, Father," Purbright said, his voice firm. "What exactly are you trying to tell me?" Father Aldridge took a slow breath, his eyes narrowing as he considered the inspector's question. "I've seen the darkness in this town," he said finally, "and I've seen it in Mrs. Reynolds. What happened between her and Mr. Orville wasn't just a simple affair. It was something far more dangerous. And now it's all coming to a head." Purbright's pulse quickened. The pieces were coming together, but there was still so much left unsaid, so much more to uncover. He knew one thing for certain now: the truth was darker than he had imagined, and it was only a matter of time before the whole town would have to confront it. Purbright stood silently, absorbing the weight of Father Aldridge's words. The priest's cryptic hints had unraveled a darker thread, one that twisted through the town's seemingly peaceful veneer. "The sins of this town," the priest had said. Purbright could feel the truth lurking just beneath the surface, something far more sinister than the scandal between the widow and the vicar. What was it? And how had it been kept hidden for so long? The priest's steady gaze never wavered, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was bracing himself for the next step. He wasn't revealing everything, not yet. Purbright could sense there was more to the story, and he needed it now. The pieces had been scattered across this quiet town, and with each passing moment they were becoming clearer. But the full picture, that still eluded him. "I've told you what I know, Inspector," Father Aldridge said, his voice quiet, but carrying a note of finality. "The rest is up to you to uncover." Purbright's patience was thin, and he was tired of dancing around the truth. You've told me enough to know there's something bigger at play here, Father. And I need you to be completely honest with me. What is it you're holding back? Father Aldridge paused, his eyes darkening slightly. It was clear that the priest wasn't someone who easily opened up, especially not about things that could bring his world crashing down. But Purbright had learned long ago that the key to breaking someone's walls was persistence. There are things I've seen over the years, Father Aldridge began, his voice softer now, almost reluctant. Things that people don't want to face. Things about Mrs. Reynolds and others in the town. She's not the only one with skeletons in her closet. Purbright stepped closer, his mind racing. What kind of things? You said the sins of this town. What does that mean? The priest's gaze dropped, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his habit. I can't say more, not yet. But I will tell you this, he said, lifting his head to meet Purbright's eyes. There's been a series of accidents. Unsolved deaths over the years. Some people in this town, important people, they've done their best to bury it all. You don't know how deep the rot goes until you start pulling at the threads. Purbright's heart rate quickened. Accidents, unsolved deaths. This was the kind of revelation that could unravel everything. What kind of accidents? He asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Father Aldridge shook his head. I don't have all the answers. But I know that the connection between these deaths, these disappearances, they're not random. They're all linked to a pattern. Mrs. Reynolds isn't just hiding her affair. She's hiding something much darker. And so are others in this town. Purbright's thoughts raced as he tried to piece together the information. The deaths, the disappearances, the secrets held by everyone, from Mrs. Reynolds to the priest himself. Flaxborough was a town built on quiet lies, each one protecting the other, all of them carefully crafted to maintain a fragile peace. But now, as the priest spoke, the truth was pushing its way to the surface, and it was starting to look like something far more disturbing than just an affair. You're telling me these deaths were no accidents, Purbright said slowly. They were part of a bigger scheme. And Mrs. Reynolds knows something about it? Father Aldridge nodded, his face pale under the dim light of the study. She knows more than she's letting on. And so does Mr. Orville. I'm not the only one who's been watching. There are others in this town who want to make sure these things stay buried, no matter the cost. Purbright's mind was working furiously now, trying to fit all the pieces together. The priest, the widow, the vicar, all of them had their roles to play in the hidden history of this town. But who were these others, and what was the price they were willing to pay to keep their secrets safe? You're telling me someone in this town is orchestrating all of this? Purbright asked, his voice tightening with the weight of the question. Father Aldridge's lips pressed together, his eyes flickering with something like fear. I didn't say that. But I know there are forces in this town, forces that don't want the truth to come out. I've seen it, felt it. And it's getting harder to stay silent. Purbright's gaze never left the priest. There was more, much more, hidden behind his words. But the priest had already said more than he had intended, and now Purbright could feel the growing sense of urgency in the air. The town's darkest secrets were about to come to light, and the only thing standing in their way was the fear of those who wanted to keep them buried. Then help me, Father, Purbright said quietly. Help me expose the truth. All of it. Father Aldridge's eyes searched his face as though weighing his options. For a moment it seemed as though he might refuse, but then he sighed heavily, resigned. I don't know if I can help you fully, Inspector. There are things I can't undo. But I'll tell you this much. The answers you seek are buried in the town's past. If you want to know the truth, you need to look deeper, past the surface of what everyone believes. And you need to be prepared for what you might find. Purbright nodded, the weight of the priest's words settling on him like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about something much bigger, something buried deep in Flaxborough's history, something that had been hidden for far too long. I'll find the truth. Father, Purbright said, his voice firm with resolve, No matter where it leads, Father Aldridge didn't respond. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something like a warning, or perhaps a regret. That told Purbright he was only scratching the surface. As the inspector turned to leave, the door creaked softly behind him. The night outside was colder than before, the shadows longer, as if the town itself were waiting for him to uncover what had been hidden for so long. The pieces were all in place. The past was catching up to Flaxborough, and soon the truth would come crashing to the surface as Purbright stepped into the night, the chill of the autumn air wrapped around him like a cloak, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The faint glow from the street lamps cast long, flickering shadows across the cobblestone streets, and for a moment Flaxborough seemed to be holding on to something, waiting for the inevitable shift. The town had lived in the quiet of its secrets for so long, but now they were rising to the surface, and Purbright could feel it, like the tug of a thread about to snap. He walked through the quiet streets with purpose, his mind racing. The priest's cryptic words hung in the air, but they didn't yet form a complete picture. The deaths, the disappearances, the things people had tried to bury, Purbright knew that he was on the verge of something explosive, but it was still unclear what those forces were that the priest had mentioned. Who or what was orchestrating this web of silence? And why had Mrs. Reynolds become involved? Her confession had revealed more than Purbright had expected, but she was still holding something back. Everyone seemed to be hiding a piece of the puzzle. His steps took him past the churchyard, now empty, save for the rustle of leaves in the wind. The silence felt heavier here than anywhere else in town, the weight of history pressing down on him. The church had witnessed generations of secrets, and it had kept them all, until now. Purbright's instincts told him that the key to understanding everything lay within the hidden corners of this very town. Flaxborough had its rules, its unspoken understanding, but all of that was about to unravel. He paused outside the church's back door, where the faint light from the vicar's study still flickered through the window. It was clear now that the vicar too was entangled in this dark history. The way he had reacted when Purbright mentioned Mrs. Reynolds, the flicker of guilt in his eyes, the quick defensiveness, it wasn't the reaction of an innocent man. But what was his role in all of this? Was he just a man caught up in something larger, or had he been complicit from the start? Purbright had learned enough to know that everyone had something to hide, but it was time to push for answers. The town couldn't afford any more silence. He needed to confront Mr. Orville. The vicar's residence was quiet when Purbright arrived, the door standing ajar, a soft light spilling from within. There was no sound of movement inside, but Purbright wasn't deterred. The tension in the air was palpable, and he knew that whatever was hidden here was about to be dragged out into the open. He knocked twice, the sound reverberating through the stillness. Moments later, the door opened, and Mr. Orville stood before him, his expression unreadable. The vicar's usual composure was still intact, but there was something about the way he stood, slightly stiff, wary, that told Purbright everything had changed since their last conversation. "Inspector," Mr. Orville greeted, his voice as measured as ever. "I didn't expect you again so soon. Has something else come to light?" Purbright studied him closely, noting the subtle shifts in the vicar's posture, the way his hands clenched at his sides. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes. "I'm afraid I have more questions, Father," Purbright said, stepping into the hallway as Mr. Orville stepped aside. "We need to talk about Mrs. Reynolds, and we need to talk about the town's past." The vicar's expression flickered, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "I see. It's clear you've made some progress in your investigation, but I'm afraid I don't have much more to offer you, Inspector. You already know what I've told you." Purbright didn't hesitate. "What about the deaths, Father? The ones you and Mrs. Reynolds are both involved in hiding. You know what I'm talking about. You've been complicit in keeping them buried." Mr. Orville's face paled, and for a brief moment He looked like a man who had just been caught in a lie, too great to cover. His lips parted, but no words came out at first. "I don't know what you mean," he said finally, his voice cracking slightly. "I've already told you everything I know." Purbright didn't back down. "Then why don't you tell me about the disappearances, about the people who've died and the ones who've just vanished?"
"You knew about them. I know you did." The vicar shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the door, as though seeking an escape.
"But there was no way out of this."
"Not anymore. Please, Inspector," Mr. Orville said, his voice lower now, tinged with fear.
"There's more to this than you realize, more than anyone here understands."
"If you dig too deep, you won't just uncover the truth, you'll bring ruin to us all." Purbright's eyes narrowed.
"What are you talking about?" The vicar glanced around the room, then stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "The town has always had its dark corners. The people here, they've made deals, sacrifices, in exchange for their quiet lives. They've traded their sins for silence. But there are things that were never meant to be uncovered." Purbright remained silent, allowing Mr. Orville to speak, to reveal whatever he was hiding. "The disappearances," the vicar continued, his voice trembling. "They weren't accidents. They were chosen. And the people who were involved, those who knew too much, they were taken. Taken by those who wanted to keep things quiet. The church, myself, Mrs. Reynolds, we've all been protecting them, keeping the truth from spilling out. But there's no more time. The past is catching up with us." Purbright's mind raced as he took in the gravity of the vicar's confession. "Who's behind this?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. "Who's pulling the strings?" The vicar's face hardened, and for a moment Purbright saw something dark flicker in his eyes.
"You don't understand."
"There are forces in this town, people who will stop at nothing to keep their secrets."
"And they won't let anyone, least of all you, disrupt their carefully built world." Purbright didn't flinch.
He had dealt with people like this before. Those who thought they could control the truth, those who thought they could bury their sins. But this time he wasn't backing down. "I'm not leaving until I get the truth," Purbright said firmly. "And I'll bring the whole town to its knees if I have to." Mr. Orville's eyes flashed with something, a mix of fear and defiance, and Purbright knew he had struck a nerve. The vicar wasn't just a man hiding behind the church's walls. He was part of something much bigger, something dangerous. As the vicar's face tightened in resignation, Purbright knew that the next steps would be crucial. The town had been hiding for too long, but the truth was beginning to surface. And soon, everyone in Flaxborough would be forced to confront the darkness that had festered beneath their quiet lives. Purbright stood still, the weight of the vicar's words sinking in. There was something larger at play here, something much more than a simple affair or a town's whispered gossip. The priest's confession had cracked open a door, and beyond it was a labyrinth of secrets, betrayal, and fear. People had disappeared. People had died. And all of it had been buried under the town's quiet surface, hidden behind the church's stone walls and the false pretenses of respectability. He looked at the vicar, whose face was pale and drawn, the fear now clear in his eyes. There was more. Purbright could feel it. But Mr. Orville had said enough for now. The pieces were coming together, but there were still too many gaps. What had happened to the missing people? Why had the vicar chosen to confess now after years of silence? And who exactly were the forces he had spoken of? "Tell me everything," Purbright said, his voice low and firm. "The truth. I won't stop until I have it." The vicar hesitated, looking as though the words were caught in his throat. For a moment, it seemed like he might break down, but instead he took a slow, deliberate breath, as though preparing himself for something he couldn't avoid any longer. "You're asking for more than I can give."
"Inspector," Mr. Orville said, his voice strained.
"There are things that have been hidden for a reason, things that go back generations in this town."
"It's not just about me or Mrs. Reynolds. It's about what Flaxborough has built itself on." Purbright's mind sharpened.
"And what's that? What has this town been built on?" The vicar's eyes flickered, a brief flash of something, regret, or maybe fear, before he answered. On silence. On the idea that some truths are better left untouched. People who were involved, people who knew too much, they were removed, disappeared. And over time that became the norm. No one asked questions. They just accepted that some things were better left in the past. And the deaths? Purbright pressed, stepping closer, his voice tightening with urgency. The disappearances? What happened to them? Mr. Orville's face twisted in something like pain, but he didn't pull away. It was all tied together. A group, an influential group in this town, wanted control. They wanted power, and when people like Mrs. Reynolds or others threatened that control by asking questions or becoming too curious, they were removed, quietly. No one noticed, no one questioned. It's how Flaxborough has always operated. The church has kept its power by keeping the past buried. Purbright felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The idea that people could simply disappear, their lives erased without a trace. He had dealt with secrets, but not like this. This wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. This was a deliberate effort to erase the past and maintain control. "And what about you, Father?" Purbright asked, his tone hardening. "Where do you fit into all of this?" The vicar looked away, his eyes unfocused, as though trying to distance himself from the question.
"I didn't choose it," he muttered.
"I was drawn into it."
"I became part of it without realizing. I thought I could control it, keep things manageable, but now it's all coming apart and there's no way to stop it." Purbright's mind raced as he processed the information.
This wasn't just about a few missing people. This was about a town that had built itself on lies and kept itself hidden behind a veil of respectability. But now the veil was tearing and the truth was coming to light. And the people who had held the strings, the people who had orchestrated it all, weren't going to give up without a fight. "Who's still in charge of this?" Purbright demanded. "Who's pulling the strings now?" The vicar swallowed hard, a bead of sweat trickling down his forehead. He hesitated again, glancing toward the door, as if hoping someone would come to stop this conversation. But there was no one else.
No more silence. "Some things are beyond my control," Mr. Orville said, his voice barely a whisper.
"You need to understand, there are forces at work in this town, people who have more power than you realize. If you keep digging, if you uncover the truth, they'll stop at nothing to make sure it stays buried." Purbright's gaze never wavered.
"I'm not backing down, Father."
"This town will face the truth." For a long moment the vicar simply stared at him, as though weighing whether to speak further. Finally, he nodded, resigned. "Go to the old cemetery," he said, quietly.
There's a tomb, one that's been sealed for years."
"That's where you'll find the answers you're looking for. But be careful, Inspector. There are things buried there that people would rather stay forgotten." Purbright's pulse quickened.
A tomb, hidden answers.
He had thought he was close, but now, it seemed, the final piece of the puzzle was just out of reach. And yet, something told him this wasn't going to be the simple closure he hoped for. There was a reason the town had been so protective of its past, and whatever lay in that tomb, it was about to shatter everything. "Thank you, Father," Purbright said, his voice steady.
"I'll find the truth no matter what." The vicar didn't respond, but Purbright could see the relief in his eyes.
It was as though the burden he had carried for so long was finally lifting. But there was also a shadow there, something darker, something that told Purbright that the truth, once uncovered, might cost more than he had bargained for. With one final glance, Purbright turned and left the vicar's study, stepping back into the cold night. The cemetery was not far, but the road ahead was uncertain. Flaxborough was no longer just a sleepy little town. It was a place filled with buried secrets, and Purbright was about to dig them all up. But the question was, what would he find when he reached the truth? Purbright's footsteps echoed through the quiet streets as he made his way toward the old cemetery. The town seemed unnervingly still, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for something. Every step he took felt like he was getting closer to something far beyond his understanding. The vicar's words, "There are things buried there that people would rather stay forgotten," kept ringing in his ears. There was no turning back now. He knew that whatever lay ahead, it would change everything. The cemetery was on the edge of town, a neglected patch of land hidden behind overgrown hedgerows and creeping ivy. It had been years since anyone had visited, and even longer since anyone had dared to disturb its forgotten tombs. Purbright pushed through the rusted iron gates, the squeal of the hinges cutting through the silence. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the shadows cast by the crooked tombstones seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. He walked deeper into the cemetery, past rows of gravestones that were worn with age. His flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged beams across the cracked stone. The sense of foreboding grew heavier with every step. The vicar had said the tomb was sealed, but Purbright knew that sometimes, when people went to great lengths to hide something, the truth was buried where no one thought to look. He stopped in front of an old mausoleum at the far end of the cemetery. It was larger than the others, its stonework darkened by years of neglect. The door was locked, but Purbright didn't hesitate. He pulled a small set of tools from his coat pocket, the cold metal clicking against the tombstone as he worked quickly, his heart pounding with anticipation. A few minutes later, the lock gave way with a dull clink, and the heavy door creaked open, revealing the darkness inside. The air that rushed out was musty and stale, but there was something more, something that felt like it had been waiting, suspended in time. Purbright stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping the room. The stone walls were lined with shelves that held a collection of old, dust-covered coffins. But in the center of the room, there was something else, a stone slab, its surface worn with age but still intact. He approached cautiously, his breath shallow, as though the very act of uncovering this secret would be enough to wake whatever had been dormant for so long. As he neared the slab, a shiver ran down his spine, the feeling of something ancient, something hidden, pressed against him from all sides. He placed his hand on the cold stone, feeling its smoothness beneath his fingers. There were no inscriptions, no marks of any kind, just a simple, unadorned slab. But Purbright knew this was the place. This was where the truth would be found. With a grunt of effort, he shoved the stone aside, revealing a small, narrow passage beneath it. The scent of earth and decay rose up, and Purbright hesitated only for a moment before crawling into the darkness. The tunnel was tight, its walls narrow and uneven, but he pushed on, the light from his flashlight illuminating the way ahead. It wasn't long before the passage opened up into a larger chamber. What he found inside made his blood run cold. The walls of the chamber were lined with old wooden crates and boxes, many of which had been opened, their contents long since rotted away. But scattered among the debris there were other things that should never have been here. Bones, fragments of clothing, pieces of old, yellowed paper, some of which were still legible, and in the center of it all, a large wooden chest. Purbright approached the chest carefully, his eyes scanning the room. The air felt heavy with the weight of the past, each item in the chamber telling a story that had been buried for too long. His fingers shook as he reached for the chest, the creaking wood echoing in the stillness as he lifted the lid. Inside, there were more papers, dozens of them, tied with thick, fraying string. He pulled one from the pile and held it up to the light. The handwriting was faint, but still readable. His heart raced as he read the words, "The town must be kept clean."
No one can know the truth about what happened.
The missing people will remain forgotten, buried with the sins of their past. Purbright's blood ran cold as he read further. The papers were filled with the names of people, some he recognized, others not, but they were all linked to the disappearances, the deaths that had been hidden. And at the bottom of each page, the same name appeared over and over again, the Council of Silence. The weight of the revelation hit him like a physical blow. The truth was here, buried in these papers, in this forgotten chamber. Flaxborough's history, its quiet, respectful facade, had been built on blood. People had been erased, sacrificed, to keep the town's power intact. The Council of Silence, whoever they were, had been pulling the strings controlling everything from the shadows. But there was still something more.
A name that had been written again and again.
A name that seemed to stand apart from the rest. Reynolds. Purbright's heart skipped a beat as the connection struck him. Mrs. Reynolds. Her name had been tied to the very heart of the conspiracy. She had known more than just an affair. She had been a part of it all along. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. Mrs. Reynolds hadn't just been hiding a personal secret. She had been protecting the town's darkest one. Her family, her connections, they had been at the center of the council. And now the truth was about to be revealed. There was no going back. Purbright's mind raced as he stuffed the papers into his coat, knowing that the town would never be the same. The truth was out, and nothing could stop it now. But even as he made his way back to the surface, his thoughts kept returning to the name that had been written over and over again, Reynolds. The town's fate was intertwined with hers in ways he hadn't yet fully understood. But he would find out. He had to. As he crawled back through the tunnel and emerged into the cold night air, Purbright felt the weight of what lay ahead. The truth had been uncovered, but the fight was just beginning. Flaxborough would never be the same again, and neither would he.